There are inheritances that arrive as money, and then there are inheritances that arrive as responsibility. The night he finally took control, the room was dressed for celebration. Crystal glasses, quiet smiles, a pen placed carefully in front of him, heavy enough to feel important. The kind of pen meant to be remembered. He believed the worst part of his life had already passed months earlier, when the private jet went silent over open water. He didn't grieve then. He reorganized, changed locks, corrected what he called accounting errors. By the time the funeral ended, he had already decided who deserved to stay and who would be erased. For half a year, documents kept finding their way to his desk. Opportunities, transfers, gifts, each one requiring nothing more than confidence and a signature. He never hesitated. People like him rarely do. Power, after all, feels lighter when you think it's permanent. What he didn't notice was how quiet the room became just before the final signature. Not applause, not admiration. Silence, the kind that waits. The pen touched the paper. And in that moment, before anyone spoke, before anyone moved, everything he thought he owned became something he could never put down again. Some stories don't unfold loudly. They reveal themselves slowly once you're already inside them. If you're still here, stay. What happened next wasn't accidental. It was constructed 6 months earlier. The call came at 4:17 in the morning. Silas heard the phone vibrate against the nightstand but didn't reach for it immediately. He knew what early calls meant. They were never good. But good and bad were categories he had stopped respecting years ago. What mattered was leverage. What mattered was positioning. By the time he answered, his voice was steady. The words on the other end were clinical. Engine failure. Atlantic. No survivors. Recovery operations underway. Silas set the phone down without responding. He sat at the edge of the bed for 11 minutes, not moving, not thinking in the way grief demands. He was calculating. The estate, the board, the timing. His father had built an empire on shipping and acquisition. Quiet wealth, the kind that didn't need to announce itself. Ports in 3 countries. Holdings and logistics, manufacturing commodities. The business moved product across oceans, and profit followed with the reliability of tide schedules. His mother had softened the edges, made the family name something people smiled at in photographs. Charity galas, university endowments, the kind of visibility that transformed wealth into legacy. His sibling, younger by 3 years, had been groomed as a successor, not because of competence, Silas believed, but because of optics, because they were easier to manage, because they smiled at the right moments and never questioned the structure they were inheriting. Silas had been kept at a distance, given roles that sounded important but carried no authority, sent to satellite offices in cities that didn't matter, praised in vague terms and excluded from decisions that shaped the empire he was supposedly part of. He had spent 15 years watching from the periphery, attending board meetings where his opinions were acknowledged and ignored, sitting through family dinners where his father's attention drifted past him to settle on the sibling who would carry the name forward. Silas had learned to smile through it, to nod, to accept the performance. But beneath the surface, he kept a ledger. Every slight, every dismissal, every time he was introduced as part of the family, but treated as decoration. He remembered all of it, and now the center was empty. The funeral was held on a gray Thursday. The estate opened its doors to a carefully curated guest list. Executives, politicians, faces Silas recognized from news coverage and quarterly reports. People who had never spoken to him directly, but who now offered condolences with the practiced ease of those who understood theater. The service was held in the estate's chapel, a space built by Silas's grandfather and filled with enough light to feel sacred without requiring faith. The eulogies were brief. His father, a visionary. His mother, a pillar. His sibling, promising, kind, gone too soon. Silas stood near the entrance, shaking hands, accepting murmured sympathies. He wore the appropriate expression: sorrow, gratitude, the quiet dignity expected of someone stepping into grief. But beneath the surface, he was elsewhere. He was thinking about the locks, about the will, about the moment He would no longer need permission. The guests filtered out slowly, offering final words before stepping into waiting cars. By evening, the estate was empty again. Silent, the staff moved through rooms, clearing glasses, folding chairs, restoring order. Silas stood in the main hall, alone for the first time in days. The chandelier above him had been imported from Vienna. His father had pointed out once, years ago, explaining its provenance with the same tone he used for quarterly earnings. Silas had nodded, pretending to care. Now it was his. All of it. 48 hours after the burial, the estate belonged to him. The transition was mechanical. Legal documents signed by the family attorney. Transfer of deeds. Access to accounts previously restricted. The staff received new instructions. Security codes were updated. Silas moved through each step with the efficiency of someone who had rehearsed this moment in his mind for years. The siblings' belongings were removed first. Clothing, awards, photographs, items that had occupied space in rooms Silas had been kept out of. He gave the staff specific instructions. No storage, no sentiment, everything to the driveway. He watched from the marble balcony as they carried boxes down the main steps, stacking them in neat rows on the gravel. When the last box was placed, Silas gave a single nod. The fire started small, controlled, professional. Within 20 minutes, everything his sibling had owned was reduced to ash. Silas stood above it all, hands in his pockets, expression calm. The smoke rose in thin columns, dissipating before it reached the trees that bordered the estate. The staff said nothing. They simply waited for further instructions. When the fire burned itself out, Silas turned and walked back inside. A line item error, he thought, finally corrected. The attorney arrived the following morning. Silas had expected someone familiar. The firm that had managed his father's affairs for decades employed 15 attorneys, most of whom Silas had met at one function or another. Men in expensive suits who spoke in careful language and billed by the quarter hour. Vance was none of those things. He arrived without announcement, escorted to the study by a staff member who seemed uncertain whether to stay or leave. Silas dismissed her with a gesture and turned his attention to the man standing in the doorway. Vance was thin, pale, somewhere between 50 and 70, with the kind of face that resisted memorization. He wore a dark suit that fit well enough but carried no designer label. His hair was gray and neatly combed. His hands, when he set the leather portfolio on the desk, were steady. He did not smile. He did not offer condolences. He simply waited. Silas gestured to the chair across from the desk that had been his father's and was now his. "You're from the firm?" "I represent the estate," Vance said. His voice was quiet, not weak, just low enough that it required attention. "Then let's get to it," Silas said, settling into a chair that felt too large and exactly right at the same time. "I assume the will is straightforward." Vance opened the portfolio. Inside were documents, neatly organized, each page tabbed and indexed. He withdrew the first set and placed them in front of Silas. "The estate has been structured under a succession protocol," Vance said. "It requires completion before full transfer of assets." Silas leaned forward, scanning the first page. Legal terminology, dense paragraphs, the kind of language designed to obscure as much as it clarified. "I'm the only surviving heir," Silas said. "What's there to complete?" "Acceptance," Vance replied. "The board requires demonstration of capacity. Your father established 12 corporate holdings as succession gifts. Each must be accepted, managed, and integrated over a 6-month period. Upon completion, full authority transfers." Silas looked up. This was it. The test his father had always withheld. The final gate. The moment Silas would prove what 15 years of exile had sharpened. He smiled. Not warmth. Recognition. "When do I start?" Vance slid the first document across the desk. Immediately, the first gift was a logistics company based in Newark. Regional operations. Steady revenue. 300 employees. Contracts with mid-tier manufacturers and retail distributors. Nothing spectacular, but functional. The kind of business that generated profit without requiring vision. Silas reviewed the financials that evening. Sitting in the study with a glass of scotch, he didn't finish. The numbers were clean, predictable, the kind of operation that had been running on autopilot for years. He saw the inefficiencies immediately. Overstaffed departments, redundant management layers, contracts that hadn't been renegotiated in 5 years. Within a week, Silas had installed new management. He replaced the regional director with someone younger, cheaper, hungrier. He restructured the contracts, squeezing suppliers for better terms and threatening to walk if they hesitated. The first round of layoffs happened on a Friday. 63 people, most of them mid-level employees who had been with the company for over a decade. Silas didn't attend the meetings. He didn't need to. The new director handled it, delivering the news with the clinical efficiency Silas had requested. By the end of the month, the company's operational costs had dropped by 14%. Vance arrived the following week to present the second gift. The second was a manufacturing plant in Ohio. Aging infrastructure, union complications, production numbers that had been declining for 3 years. The plant produced industrial components, parts of machinery used in construction and agriculture. Necessary, unglamorous, profitable if managed correctly. Silas reviewed the union contracts first. They were dense, pages of negotiated terms that protected wages, hours, benefits, and working conditions, the kind of agreements that prioritized stability over efficiency. Silas saw them as obstacles. He brought in consultants, labor specialists who understood how to navigate union resistance without triggering strikes. They recommended a phased approach, small cuts, incremental changes, pressure applied gradually until the union had no choice but to negotiate. Silas ignored the recommendation. He restructured the contracts unilaterally, citing economic necessity and market conditions. When the union pushed back, he threatened to close the plant entirely and move operations overseas. The union blinked first. New contracts were signed within 6 weeks. Wages frozen, benefits reduced, overtime eliminated. Production costs dropped by 18%. Silas signed integration documents without hesitation. Vance collected them with the same quiet neutrality he had shown during the first transfer. By the third gift, a pattern emerged. Each holding was presented as an opportunity, a chance to demonstrate vision, efficiency, control. Vance would arrive, portfolio in hand, and deliver the paperwork with the same calm precision. Silas would review the financials, identify inefficiencies, and restructure without sentiment. He began to enjoy it. The third gift was a shipping subsidiary in Charleston. Outdated equipment, high labor costs. Silas modernized the fleet, automated the docks, and cut the workforce by 40%. The fourth was a commodities trading firm in Chicago. Underperforming assets, conservative strategies. Silas brought in aggressive traders, leveraged high-risk positions, and tripled short-term returns. The fifth was a real estate holding company in Phoenix. Legacy properties, low occupancy rates. Silas sold off the underperforming assets, raised rents on profitable ones, and displaced 200 long-term tenants in the process. Each decision increased efficiency. Each signature consolidated power. Silas held meetings in the study, the same room where his father had once made decisions without consulting him. He brought in consultants, fired executives who hesitated when he gave orders, and appeared in quarterly briefings with the confidence of someone who had always belonged. The name that had once been attached to his father now carried his face. The board began to defer to him. Investors took his calls. By the sixth gift, Silas no longer questioned the process. He simply executed. The seventh gift was different, not in structure, in weight. It was a chemical processing company based in Louisiana. The financials looked stable at first glance, but buried in the operational reports were references to environmental assessments, remediation costs, and pending litigation. Silas skimmed the details. The litigation involved groundwater contamination near one of the processing facilities, local residents claiming health issues, a class action lawsuit that had been moving through the courts for 3 years. The company's legal team had been managing it quietly, settling smaller claims, delaying larger ones. Silas saw it as noise, He signed the transfer documents, accepted the company, and moved on. He never asked about the contamination, never reviewed the environmental assessments, never considered what accepting the company might mean beyond the balance sheet. The eighth gift was a tech startup acquisition, a company his father had purchased 2 years earlier. Promising technology, poor execution. The product, software designed to streamline supply chain management, had potential, but the team lacked direction. Silas restructured immediately. He fired the founders, brought in new leadership, and pushed the product to market before it was ready. The launch was a disaster. The software had critical flaws, data breaches, system failures. Clients pulled contracts within weeks. The company collapsed in 4 months. Silas absorbed the loss without comment. It was a miscalculation, but not a failure. Failures were permanent. Miscalculations were just data points. He signed the next set of documents Vance presented without reviewing them as carefully as he had the first few. By the ninth gift, Silas had stopped reading the fine print. It wasn't carelessness. It was confidence. The documents were dense, filled with legal terminology that looped back on itself. Clauses within clauses. Subclauses referencing appendices that referenced other documents entirely. Silas had lawyers for that. He had teams. What mattered was the outcome, the consolidation, the proof that he could manage what had been denied to him. The ninth gift was a pharmaceutical distribution company. The 10th was a textile manufacturer in Bangladesh. The 11th was a mining operation in Nevada. Each one required decisions, signatures, restructuring. Silas moved through them with the precision of someone who had been preparing for this his entire life. He no longer asked questions. He no longer hesitated. By the 11th gift, he was signing without reading at all. What Silas didn't see were the other meetings, the ones that happened in rooms he was never invited to. While he restructured companies and signed documents, the board convened in private. Executives whose names didn't appear on any of the transfers. Legal advisors who worked for firms Silas had never heard of. They reviewed every signature, every decision, every restructuring. They took notes. Vance attended these meetings, though he rarely spoke. He simply provided updates, confirmation that the protocol was proceeding as designed. No one questioned the process. No one expressed concern. The architecture had been built long before Silas ever touched a pen, and now it was simply a matter of waiting. The 12th gift was presented at the state's annual gala. It was the kind of event designed to be remembered. The grounds lit with soft amber lights strung between trees that had been planted by Silas's grandfather. A string quartet positioned near the fountain, playing pieces that sounded expensive without being recognizable. Guests in tailored suits and gowns moved between champagne and conversation with the ease of people who had always belonged. Silas stood at the center of it all. He wore a custom suit, Italian wool, charcoal gray, a watch that cost more than most people earned in a year. He moved through the crowd, shaking hands, accepting congratulations, receiving the deference he had spent 6 months reclaiming. People who had ignored him for 15 years now sought his attention. Board members introduced him to investors. Politicians asked for a perspective on policy. A journalist from a financial publication requested an interview. Silas accepted it all with the calm assurance of someone who had finally stepped into the role he was meant to occupy. The final document sat on a table in the library, just off the main hall, a small, private space where the most important transactions were conducted. Leather chairs, shelves lined with first editions. A single lamp casting warm light across the mahogany surface. Vance was already there when Silas arrived. The portfolio was open. The pen, heavy silver, engraved with a family crest, rested beside the signature line. "This is the final transfer," Vance said. $48 million in liquid assets. Upon signature, full authority passes to you. The protocol will be complete. Silas picked up the pen. It felt solid, final. He glanced at the document. Pages of text. The same dense legal structure he had seen 11 times before. His eyes moved to the signature line, the space where his name would complete the process. "Before you sign." Vance's voice was quiet, almost gentle. Silas paused. The pen hovered above the paper. Have you personally verified the sovereign liability clauses attached to the gifts? The question hung in the air. Silas looked up. Vance's expression hadn't changed. Calm, neutral, waiting. I've had my team review everything, Silas said. Extensively. That wasn't the question. Silas smiled. Not uncertainty. Amusement. I don't need to verify what I already control. The pen moved. His signature flowed across the paper with smooth, practiced strokes. His name, in full, committing him to the final piece of structure he believed he had conquered. Silas set the pen down. Vance collected the document without comment. He closed the portfolio. And then he spoke again. The authorities will arrive in approximately 12 minutes. Silas didn't move. The words reached him, but they didn't connect. Not immediately. What? Vance's voice remained steady. The 12 gifts were not assets. They were liabilities. Shell companies. Each one attached to toxic debt, environmental violations, fraud investigations, and sovereign penalties that exceed the estate's total value. The room felt smaller. By accepting and signing, you became the sole legal entity responsible for all of it. Silas set the pen down slowly. His hand was steady, but something in his chest had tightened. That's not possible. It is binding, Vance said. You signed transfer of liability 12 times. Each signature was witnessed. Each document filed with the appropriate regulatory bodies. The board approved every step. I had lawyers. You had advisors, Vance corrected, none of whom were authorized to act on your behalf in matters of sovereign exposure. You signed personally. You accepted personally. The liability is yours. Silas's breath caught. The sound of voices drifted in from a hallway. Laughter. Glasses clinking. The party continued, unaware. The fortune has been diverted, Vance said, into a private trust established 6 months ago for the victims of the companies you now legally represent. The trust is no longer connected to you. The estate is no longer accessible. What remains is a debt. Silas stood. His hands were shaking. You can't do this. Vance didn't respond. He simply watched. The sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. Heavy, deliberate, the kind that didn't belong at a gala. When the trap is built carefully enough, the prey never sees the walls until they've already closed. The authorities arrive quietly. No sirens, no spectacle. Just 3 men in dark suits who moved through the gala with the calm efficiency of people who had done this many times before. They found Silas in the library. He was still standing near the table, staring at the space where the document had been. Vance had stepped to the side, portfolio in hand, no longer part of the transaction. One of the men spoke. The words were procedural. Rights, charges, legal representation. Silas didn't hear most of it. He was thinking about the signatures. All 12 of them. The pen in his hand. The confidence. The certainty that he had finally won. The man finished speaking and produced a pair of handcuffs. The metal was cold against Silas's wrists. They led him through the hall, past the guests who turned to stare, past the champagne and the lights, and the string quartet still playing near the fountain, past the life Silas had built in 6 months of calculated ambition. No one spoke. A few people pulled out phones. Others whispered behind raised hands. Most simply watched, their expressions caught between shock and the uncomfortable fascination that comes from witnessing someone else's collapse. Silas kept his head up. He didn't look at them. He didn't look at anything. From the back of the room, Vance stood near the doorway, portfolio in hand. He watched as they placed Silas in the back of an unmarked vehicle and closed the door, watched as the car pulled away from the estate, its taillights disappearing into the tree line. His expression didn't change. There was no satisfaction in it, no pity either, just the quiet finality of a task completed. He turned and walked back into the gala. The guests had already begun to disperse. The news broke before midnight. Financial networks ran the story first, then the mainstream outlets. By morning, it was everywhere. Hargrave air arrested on fraud charges. The headlines varied, but the details were consistent. Silas Hargrave, sole surviving heir to the Hargrave fortune, arrested on charges of corporate fraud, environmental negligence, money laundering, and conspiracy to evade sovereign penalties. The estimated debt, $430 million. The assets available to cover it, none. The companies he had accepted were dissected in public. Journalists filed requests for documents. Investigators pulled records. Environmental groups released reports they had been holding for years, waiting for the right moment. The chemical processing company in Louisiana had contaminated groundwater across 3 counties. The contamination had been documented, ignored, covered up through legal maneuvering and delayed remediation. The mining operation in Nevada had violated labor laws, safety regulations, and indigenous land agreements. Workers had been injured. Some had died. The company had settled quietly, burying the cases under non-disclosure agreements. The pharmaceutical distribution company had been involved in price-fixing schemes that inflated costs for life-saving medications. Patients had suffered. Some had died because they couldn't afford treatment. The textile manufacturer in Bangladesh operated facilities where workers, some of them children, were paid below minimum wage and subjected to conditions that violated international labor standards. Each company had been profitable. Each company had caused harm. And Silas, by signing, had become the legal face of all of it. The estate was seized within 72 hours. Federal agents arrived with warrants and inventory lists. They moved through the rooms methodically, cataloging everything: furniture, art, the first editions in the library, the chandelier imported from Vienna, the marble balcony where Silas had stood and watched his siblings' belongings burn. All of it appraised, all of it marked for liquidation. It wouldn't be enough, not even close. The trust was revealed a week later, a private fund, established 6 months earlier, designed to compensate victims of corporate malfeasance. The Hargrave fortune, every asset, every holding, every carefully managed investment, had been transferred into it before the jet went down. The timing was surgical. The jet, the funeral, the succession protocol. None of it had been an accident. Investigators traced the structure back through shell companies, offshore accounts, and legal entities that existed only on paper. At the center of it all was a directive signed by Silas's father 3 months before the crash. A directive that established the trust. A directive that transferred the fortune. A directive that ensured the wealth would never pass to Silas, no matter what he believed. The trust had been designed to operate in silence. No press releases. No public announcements. Just systematic compensation delivered to those who had been harmed by the companies Silas had accepted. Medical care for families affected by the contaminated water in Louisiana. Legal support for workers injured in the Nevada mining operation. Restitution for patients who had been overcharged for medication. Relocation funds for families displaced by Silas's real estate restructuring. The money moved quietly, distributed through legal channels that had been prepared years in advance. The Hargrave name was attached to it now, not as a legacy of power, but as an admission of guilt. Silas was denied bail. The judge cited flight risk, the severity of the charges, and the scale of the financial exposure. The courtroom was cold. Fluorescent lights. A bench that felt too high. Prosecutors who laid out the charges with the same quiet efficiency Vance had once used to present documents. Silas sat in silence. His lawyers argued. Procedural errors. Coercion. Lack of intent. None of it mattered. The signatures were real. The liability was binding. And the fortune he had believed was his had never existed in the first place. The cell was small. Concrete walls. A narrow bed. A single window that looked out onto a courtyard where nothing grew. Silas sat on the bed and stared at the floor. For the first time in 6 months, there were no documents to review, no decisions to make, no companies to restructure, just silence and the growing understanding of what had been done to him. He thought about the 12 gifts, the logistics company in Newark, the manufacturing plant in Ohio, the chemical processor, the mining operation. Each one had seemed like an opportunity. Each one had been a trap. He thought about the signatures. How confident he had been. How certain that he was finally claiming what had always been his. He thought about Vance, the quiet man with a leather portfolio who had delivered each gift without emotion, without hesitation. Silas had believed Vance was simply a messenger. Now he understood. Vance had been the architect. Silas's legal team consisted of 3 attorneys from a firm he had hired during the first week of the succession protocol. They were competent, experienced, expensive. None of it helped. The lead attorney, a man named Garrison, visited Silas in the detention facility 2 weeks after the arrest. He sat across from Silas in a small room with a metal table and no windows. "We've reviewed the documents," Garrison said. "All 12 transfers. The liability clauses are ironclad. Your signature is on every page." Silas didn't respond. "The prosecution is arguing that you knowingly accepted companies with criminal exposure. They're building a case that you intended to profit from a fraud while shielding the estate from liability." "I didn't know." "It doesn't matter," Garrison said. "You signed. That's acceptance under the law. Intent is secondary." Silas leaned back in the chair. "What about Vance?" Garrison frowned. "Who?" "The attorney. The one who presented the documents." "We haven't been able to locate anyone by that name," Garrison said. "The firm that managed your father's estate has no record of an attorney named Vance. No employment history. No case files." Silas stared at him. "That's not possible. He was there every week. He brought the documents." "I'm telling you what we found," Garrison said. "Or rather, what we didn't find. Whoever presented those documents to you, he doesn't exist in any legal capacity we can verify." The room felt colder. The board convened 3 weeks after Silas's arrest. They met in the same conference room where Silas had once sat through presentations, watching his father make decisions without consulting him. Now the room belonged to people Silas had never met. The board had restructured. New members, new leadership, new priorities. They reviewed the succession protocol. They reviewed the transfers. They reviewed the outcomes. And then they voted to sever all remaining ties to the Hargrave name. The companies Silas had accepted were placed into receivership. The liabilities transferred to a special administrative entity designed to manage corporate failures. The board walked away clean. Silas remained legally bound. The trial lasted 4 months. The prosecution presented their case with methodical precision. Each company, each violation, each signature. They brought in witnesses, workers from the manufacturing plant in Ohio who had lost their jobs when Silas restructured the union contracts, families from Louisiana who had been drinking contaminated water for years while the chemical company delayed remediation, patients who had been priced out of medication by the pharmaceutical distribution schemes. The testimonies were devastating, not because they were dramatic, but because they were ordinary. People describing harm in plain language, medical bills they couldn't pay, jobs they couldn't replace, futures that had been quietly dismantled by decisions made in boardrooms they would never see. Silas sat at the defense table and listened. His lawyers objected, cross-examined, challenged the admissibility of evidence. It didn't matter. The jury saw the signatures. They saw the companies. They saw the harm. The defense tried to argue coercion. They presented the succession protocol as a manipulative structure designed to trap Silas into accepting liability he couldn't understand. The prosecution countered with the documentation. Every transfer had been accompanied by financial disclosures, legal briefings, risk assessments. Silas had signed acknowledgement forms confirming he had reviewed the materials. He had hired advisors. He had had access to legal counsel. The argument that he was coerced fell apart under scrutiny. The verdict was delivered on a Tuesday afternoon. Guilty on 17 counts. The courtroom was silent. Silas didn't react. He simply sat, hands folded on the table, staring at a point somewhere past the judge's bench. Sentencing was scheduled for the following month, but the financial penalties were immediate. Restitution, damages, fees that would follow Silas for the rest of his life, and likely beyond it. $430 million. He would never be free of it, not in any sense that mattered. The estate was sold in pieces. The furnishings went to auction first. the art, the library, the desk where Silas had signed his name 12 times, each stroke bringing him closer to the trap he never saw. The buyers were quiet, anonymous, people who appreciated history but had no interest in sentiment. The chandelier from Vienna sold for less than expected. The marble balcony was dismantled and sold to a salvage company. The driveway, where Silas had burned his siblings' belongings, was repaid before the property was listed. By the end of the year, there was no physical evidence that the Hargrave family had ever lived there. The estate became just another property. Expensive, historic, empty. Vance disappeared. No forwarding address. No final statement. He simply stopped appearing. Investigators tried to trace him. They found records of meetings he had attended, documents he had filed, signatures he had witnessed, but no employment history, no tax records, no address. It was as though he had been assembled specifically for the succession protocol, and once his function was complete, he simply dissolved back into the structure that had created him. Some of the investigators believed he was a fabrication, a composite identity used by multiple people to maintain the illusion of continuity. Others believed he was real, just protected by the same legal architecture that had trapped Silas. No one ever found him. The trust continued its work. Quietly, without fanfare, compensation delivered to those who had been harmed, medical care for the families in Louisiana. The contamination hadn't been their fault, but they had been living with the consequences for years. Now, there was money for treatment, for relocation, for lawyers who could hold the company accountable in ways that had been impossible before. Legal support for the workers in Nevada, families who had lost loved ones in mining accidents that should have been prevented. Now, there was money for settlements, for memorials, for educating the children left behind, restitution for the patients who had been overcharged. The pharmaceutical schemes had been legal, technically, but that didn't make them right. Now there was money to cover the costs, to pay off medical debt, to give people access to the care they had been denied. Rebuilding for the families Silas had displaced with his real estate restructuring. The evictions had been legal, the rent increases justified by market conditions, but people had still lost their homes. Now there was money for deposits, for moving costs, for starting over. The Hargrave name was attached to all of it, not as a gesture of goodwill, but as a record. Sentencing took place on a cold morning in March. The courtroom was full. Victims, journalists, legal observers. Silas was led in wearing a suit that no longer fit quite right. He had lost weight. His face looked drawn, older. The judge reviewed the charges, the convictions, the scope of the harm, and then he spoke. 15 years, federal prison, no possibility of parole for the first 7. The financial penalties remained in place. Restitution would be collected from any future earnings, any assets Silas might acquire for the rest of his life. The judge's voice was calm, clinical. This was not punishment delivered in anger. It was accountability, administered with the same precision the succession protocol had employed. Silas was led away. The courtroom emptied. The case was closed. Silas adjusted to prison the way people adjust to any inescapable reality. He woke at the same time every morning, ate the same meals, followed the same routines. He worked in the prison library, shelving books, processing requests. It was quiet work, solitary. He didn't speak much. Other inmates left him alone. His case had been publicized enough that most people knew who he was, what he had done, or rather, what he had been convicted of doing. Some respected the scale of it. Others resented the wealth he had once represented. Silas didn't care either way. He spent his evenings in his cell, staring at the wall, thinking about the 12 gifts. He still couldn't pinpoint the exact moment the trap had closed. Maybe it was the 7th gift, when he stopped reading the environmental assessments. Maybe it was the 9th, when he stopped questioning the clauses. Maybe it was the very first signature, when he accepted that the protocol was legitimate and never considered what accepting might mean. Or maybe it had been decided long before that. The moment his father drafted the directive, the moment the trust was established. The moment the family decided that wealth built on harm couldn't be passed cleanly to the next generation without someone answering for it. 3 years into his sentence, Silas received a letter. It arrived without a return address. Plain envelope, standard paper. Inside was a single page. No signature, no greeting, just a few lines. The estate was never yours to inherit. It was yours to carry. Your father understood what you refused to see. Some debts cannot be forgiven. They can only be transferred. You were always going to pay. Silas read it twice. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer beside his bed. He never opened it again. Silas was released after serving just over 7 years. Parole, good behavior, overcrowding. He walked out of the facility on a Tuesday morning, carrying a single bag with the belongings he had been allowed to keep. No one was waiting for him. The trust had continued its work. The victims had been compensated. The companies dissolved or restructured under new ownership. The Hargrave name had faded from headlines. Silas took a bus to a city he had never lived in and found a room in a building that didn't ask questions. He got a job washing dishes at a restaurant 2 blocks away. The work was simple, repetitive, no decisions, no signatures, just water and soap and the rhythm of plates passing through his hands. At night, he would sit by the window and look out at the street below, people moving through their lives, working, laughing, struggling in ways that had nothing to do with inheritance or succession or the weight of choices made in rooms they would never enter. Silas thought about the 12 gifts sometimes, about Vance, about the moment he signed his name for the 12th time and believed he had finally won. He didn't feel regret. Exactly. Regret required the belief that things could have been different. Silas understood now that they couldn't have been. The trap had been built long before he ever touched a pen, and he had walked into it willingly, confidently, certain that power was something he could claim rather than something that claimed him. There are debts that can be paid in money, and then there are debts that require everything else. Silas had believed he was inheriting power. What he inherited was the weight of choices made long before he ever touched a pen. The companies, the violations, the harm his family had profited from while maintaining the appearance of respectability. His father had understood something Silas never did. That wealth, when built on suffering, does not pass cleanly from one generation to the next. It demands an accounting, and someone eventually has to pay it. The trust continues its work, quietly, without fanfare. Compensation delivered to those who were harmed, medical care, legal support, rebuilding what was taken. The Hargrave name is attached to it now, not as a legacy of power, but as a reminder. Silas remains in the city. He still washes dishes, still sits by the window at night. He no longer thinks about the estate, about the balcony, about the moment he believed he had finally claimed what was his. Some nights, he thinks about the pen, how heavy it felt, how certain he had been, and how wrong certainty can be when the structure beneath it was never built to hold you up. There are stories that end, and then there are stories that simply stop being told. This was one of them. Justice, when it arrives, does so without warmth. It doesn't apologize. It doesn't celebrate. It simply settles, like a debt paid in full. This was Revenge Chronicles. Some debts are answered in silence. Others echo long after the voices stop. They don't demand forgiveness. They demand silence and time. This one has been paid. There are others that haven't. When they come due, Revenge Chronicles will remember them.